So at this point in the process, we've got the concrete in, it's cured for 5 days. After that, we put the epoxy on, and now we are ready to start final assembling this machine. Before we can do that, though, there's a very important step, and that is redoing the coplanarity checks that we did previously. But in this case, we're going to be trying to get to within about 2,000ths of coplanarity between the y-axis rails. What that means, again, is that the y-axis rails are going to be laying in the same plane within 2,000ths after we're done doing this inspection and then doing the fine shimming. Before we can jump right into that, there's a couple of things that we got to be mindful of. First, the tools that we're going to need. You're going to want the coplanarity check gauge. You're going to want your indicator. You're going to need your box of shims. We've used some of them, but the remaining ones we're going to potentially need for this. You're going to need a 5/32 Allen wrench to break loose the bolts that hold on these plates. And then we're going to need a 3/16 Allen wrench to loosen up the bolts that hold the y-axis rails onto the rail mounts. So off camera, what I did just in prep was I came and broke all the bolts loose. These button head cap screws, these are all loose. And the reason they need to be loose is because we're going to be adjusting the heights here. Once we finalize the shimming and get the bolts back up tight, the last thing we'll do is go and tighten those back up. Secondly, I've already put the coplanarity gauge on the machine along this diagonal, and I zeroed it using the exact same method that was shown in a previous video. And now I've got it laying over the opposing diagonal. And what I'm seeing off of the indicator is that these two corners here are high by 7/1000ths. So if you recall from the previous video, before we shimmed, these two corners were low by, I think it was 16/1000ths. And so we put two of the thick shims in the opposing corners, and that got us within, I think it was about 7/1000ths. The concrete, as it cures, it is going to move a little bit. So this is 7/1000ths on the other side of zero, which means we have to come in and put an additional 7/1000ths of shim in these corners. And doing that should get us within 1 or 2,000ths. So I'm going to go ahead and off camera do that, put those shims in, and then we'll go ahead and set the indicator back up and see where we're at. So off camera, what I did was I put another 0.2 millimeter shim on this corner and a 0.2 millimeter shim on that corner. I used my coplanarity check gauge along this diagonal to re-zero my indicator. And then I picked the gauge up and I set it along this diagonal as it's showing here to get a reading. And looking at the indicator, I'm about 1.5 thousandths. So that means my y-axis rails are coplanar, or they're lying in the same plane with about 1.5 thousandths of error. Now I could keep going here and maybe use some of the fine shims and try to really dial this into less than 1.5, 2 thousandths. But in reality, if you get it within 2 thousandths, it's going to be plenty good enough for this machine. Now, what does it mean exactly? Coplanarity is really important because that's what allows the machine to cut a flat surface. This 1.5 thousandths of error over that 30 inches of distance in reality means that over the XY envelope of the machine, which is about 23 by 21 inches, it'll be able to produce a surface that is flat to likely around 1,000th or better. So that's why it's so important to do this step. Now, before I can go ahead and move on with the rest of the assembly, there's a couple of things that I got to do. Most importantly is I need to use a tape measure and just make sure that in the course of shimming, I didn't make my y-axis rails out of parallel. So if you'll recall from the previous video, one of the previous videos, we set the inside edge to 34 inches at the front and at the back. You're just going to want to make sure that you double check that again before you tighten down these button head cap screws, just to make sure that we're reasonably parallel before when the gantry goes on. When the gantry goes on, the gantry itself is going to actually be what is going to make these parallel, like perfectly parallel, but we just want to get it reasonably close for now. After I make them parallel, like I said, you want to go back and tighten up all these button head cap screws, and make sure the socket head cap screws holding the rails are all tight. And then from there, yeah, you'll be able to just go ahead and proceed with the assembly. Thanks for watching this video.